Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Last Call. The Carter household had always been filled with the buzz of activity. Between Pastor Robert Carter's responsibilities at the church and the daily routines of his family, their home rarely experienced a moment of quiet. Yet, on this particular Sunday, an unfamiliar stillness seemed to linger. Robert sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his pocket calendar. He had just returned from visiting his brother-in-law, Edward "Eddie" Green, who had been battling cancer for over a year. Eddie's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the last few weeks, leaving him bedridden, pale, and visibly weaker each time Robert visited. Robert flipped through the calendar, noting the church's events for the week. Bible study on Monday, youth group on Tuesday, choir practice on Thursday, and a food drive on Friday. His pen hovered over Wednesday, the only blank day of the week. Eddie's question lingered in his mind. So Wednesday is free? Robert shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease that question had stirred. He closed the calendar and muttered a prayer, asking for strength and clarity in the days to come. The next morning, Robert returned to Eddie's house. The small, modest home was quiet except for the faint hum of a radio playing gospel hymns in the living room. Eddie's wife, Margaret, greeted Robert with a weary smile. "He's been asking for you," she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Robert nodded and stepped into the bedroom. Eddie lay propped up on a pile of pillows, his sunken eyes lighting up at the sight of his brother-in-law. "Robert," Eddie rasped, his voice weak but steady. "I need to talk to you." Robert pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. "I'm here, Eddie. What's on your mind?" Eddie's gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight filtered through thin curtains. "I've been thinking about the church and the work left to do. Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" Robert frowned. "We do what we can, Eddie. The Lord knows our hearts." Eddie nodded slowly. "I've been planning my exit, you know. I don't want to linger, don't want to be a burden." He paused, his eyes locking onto Robert's. "Wednesday, that's my day." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Robert felt a chill run down his spine but managed to keep his composure. "Eddie, you don't need to think about that. Focus on resting, on healing." Eddie smiled faintly. "I've made my peace, Robert. But promise me something, when the time comes, keep the church running. Don't let it falter." Robert nodded, though his chest felt heavy. "You have my word." By Tuesday evening, Eddie's condition had worsened. Margaret called Robert late that night, her voice trembling. "I think it's time, Robert. He's asking for you." Robert arrived at the house within minutes. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the faint aroma of a candle burning on the bedside table. Eddie lay motionless, his breathing shallow. Robert knelt by the bed and took Eddie's hand. "I'm here." Eddie's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he seemed lucid, his gaze sharp and focused. "Wednesday," he whispered. Robert swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "It's Tuesday night, Eddie. Just rest." Eddie smiled, a peaceful, knowing smile, and closed his eyes. By the early hours of Wednesday morning, Eddie had passed away. Eddie's funeral was held the following Sunday, drawing a large crowd of mourners. Friends, family, and church members came together to celebrate his life and offer their condolences to Margaret and the Carter family. In the days that followed, Robert threw himself into his pastoral duties. It was his way of coping, a distraction from the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. But the memory of Eddie's final words lingered. Then came the phone call. It was late on a Wednesday night, and Robert was sitting in his study, preparing his sermon for the upcoming Sunday. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet. He glanced at the caller ID, blank. Assuming it was a telemarketer or a wrong number, he let it ring out. But the phone rang again, and again. Finally, Robert picked up. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice that made his blood run cold. "What does the church have going on this week?" Robert's hand tightened around the receiver. It was Eddie's voice, clear, unmistakable. "Eddie," he stammered. The line went dead. Robert spent the rest of the night wide awake, his mind racing. He tried to rationalize the call. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe his grief was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew what he had heard. The next morning, he confided in Margaret. Her face went pale as he recounted the incident. "It's not possible," she whispered. "Eddie's gone." "I know," Robert said. "But it was his voice, Margaret. I'm sure of it." Margaret shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You need rest, Robert. You've been under so much stress." But rest was elusive. Over the following weeks, the calls continued. Always on a Wednesday. Always the same question. What does the church have going on this week? Determined to uncover the truth, Robert began documenting the calls, noting the exact times and details of each one. He even recorded some of them, though they offered little beyond the chilling familiarity of Eddie's voice. One evening, Robert decided to answer the call with a direct question. "Eddie, why are you calling?" There was a long silence before the voice replied, "Wednesday is free." The line went dead. The response left Robert shaken. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Calm, confident, as if Eddie were still planning, still organizing his life from beyond the grave. Word of the mysterious calls began to spread. Some members of the congregation saw them as a sign, a divine message from Eddie himself. Others whispered about restless spirits and unfinished business. For Robert, the calls were both a source of dread and a strange comfort. They were a reminder of Eddie's unwavering faith and his deep connection to the church. But they also raised questions that Robert couldn't answer. Questions that challenged everything he believed about life, death, and the afterlife. As the calls continued, Robert found himself standing at a crossroads. Was this a test of faith, a message from God, or something far more unsettling? The answers, he knew, lay somewhere in the shadowed spaces between certainty and doubt, on the edges of faith and fear. And as Wednesday approached once again, Robert braced himself for whatever might come next. Robert Carter sat in the quiet of his study, staring at the phone on his desk. It had been 2 weeks since the last call, and the absence of Eddie's voice left an unsettling void. Each passing Wednesday carried an uneasy anticipation, as though the stillness itself was part of a larger message. The church had always been his refuge, a place where answers came through scripture and prayer. But these calls defied explanation. They weren't an outright horror, but they left a mark, subtle, invasive, like the weight of an unanswered question. Robert tried to pray, but even the words felt hollow. For the first time in years, doubt began to creep into the corners of his faith. Margaret visited the parsonage that Thursday morning, her face drawn with worry. "I can't stop thinking about those calls," she confessed, sitting across from Robert at the kitchen table. "It's like he's still here, watching, waiting." Robert hesitated. "Do you think Eddie would have wanted to stay? I mean, after everything?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "No, he was ready to go. He said his goodbyes, Robert. He made peace with God. But these calls, they're not peaceful." Her words struck a chord. Robert had felt it too. A sense of incompletion, as if Eddie had left something unsaid. Margaret leaned closer. "Have you told anyone else?" "No," Robert admitted. "I didn't want to alarm the congregation." "You should. Maybe someone has experienced something similar." Robert nodded, though his instincts warned him against stirring the waters. He wasn't ready to face the questions or the answers that might follow. That Sunday, after the morning service, Robert lingered in the sanctuary. The last of the congregation had trickled out, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the overhead lights. "Pastor!" Robert turned to see James, the church janitor, standing at the back of the room. James was a quiet man in his late 50s, known for his meticulous care of the church grounds. "Yes, James?" James hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. I've been meaning to talk to you about something strange. Robert's heart skipped. Go on. James took a step closer. Last Wednesday, I was cleaning the office after Bible study, and the phone rang. It was late, around 9. I thought it was odd, so I picked it up. Robert's pulse quickened. What did you hear? James's expression darkened. It was Eddie. I swear it was him, Pastor. He asked me about the church schedule for the week. A chill settled over Robert. Did you tell anyone? James shook his head. I didn't want to sound crazy, but Pastor, that voice, I'll never forget it. The revelation confirmed what Robert had feared. This wasn't a figment of his imagination. Others had heard Eddie's voice too. But why? And why only on Wednesdays? Robert spent the next few days combing through church records, looking for any pattern or clue that might explain the phenomenon. He even revisited Eddie's old sermons, hoping his words might hold some hidden meaning. But the answers remained elusive, buried beneath layers of routine and memory. Desperate for clarity, Robert reached out to an old friend, Daniel Pierce, a former police detective who had recently retired in town. Daniel, I need your help, Robert said over coffee in the church office. Daniel raised an eyebrow. This doesn't sound like a pastoral matter. It's complicated, Robert admitted. And it involves Eddie. Daniel listened intently as Robert recounted the events of the past weeks. When he finished, Daniel leaned back, his expression thoughtful. You're sure it's his voice? Positive, Robert said. And now James has heard it too. Daniel nodded. Okay, let's approach this logically. Calls don't come from nowhere. Have you checked the phone records? Robert hesitated. I didn't think of that. Then that's our first step, Daniel said. If there's a source, we'll find it. The following Monday, Robert and Daniel visited the local phone company. After some persuasion, they were allowed access to the church's call logs. There's no record of calls at those times, the technician said, frowning at the screen. It's like they never happened. Daniel exchanged a glance with Robert. What about anomalies? Anything out of the ordinary? The technician shrugged. The system shows blank caller IDs, but that's not uncommon. Could be a faulty line or interference. Robert's stomach churned. The lack of answers only deepened the mystery. That Wednesday, Robert stayed late at the church, determined to face the next call head-on. He sat in his office, the phone inches from his hand, as the clock ticked closer to midnight. When the phone finally rang, Robert didn't hesitate. Hello? The line crackled. What does the church have going on this week? Eddie? Robert's voice trembled. There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing before the line went dead. The next morning, Robert shared the experience with Daniel. We need to figure out where these calls are coming from, Daniel said. If there's no record, then someone's going out of their way to make it untraceable. But why? Robert asked. Daniel's expression darkened. That's what we need to find out. Daniel suggested they investigate Eddie's house, hoping to uncover something that might explain the calls. Margaret reluctantly agreed, though the idea unsettled her. The house was exactly as Eddie had left it, untouched, frozen in time. Robert and Daniel combed through his belongings, focusing on his office. It was there, buried beneath a stack of old notebooks, that they found a folder labeled Wednesday. Inside were handwritten notes, schedules, and a detailed outline for a project Eddie had been working on. A Wednesday night prayer group for church members struggling with their faith. This must have been important to him, Robert said, his voice heavy with emotion. Daniel nodded. Maybe he felt like he didn't finish what he started. The discovery added a new layer to the mystery. Was Eddie's voice a call to action? A reminder to carry on his work? Or something else entirely? Robert decided to honor Eddie's vision, organizing the first Wednesday prayer group the following week. The turnout was overwhelming, and the sessions quickly became a cornerstone of the church community. But the calls didn't stop. If anything, they grew more frequent, more insistent. What does the church have going on this week? The question haunted Robert, echoing in his mind long after the calls ended. Wednesday nights at the church had taken on a life of their own. The prayer group, born from Eddie's forgotten notes, had become a fixture of the community. Yet the eerie calls continued, lingering like shadows in the minds of those who had heard Eddie's voice. Robert Carter stood at the pulpit, watching the room fill with familiar faces. Many came seeking comfort, but a few, those who had heard whispers of the calls, wore expressions of unease. "Tonight, let us focus on faith in uncertainty," Robert began. His voice carried authority, though inside, he felt the weight of the unanswered questions. At the back of the room, Margaret shifted in her seat, her eyes flitting toward the door as if expecting someone, or something, to arrive. After the group dispersed, Robert lingered in the sanctuary, the silence amplifying his thoughts. The phone in his office rang, startling him. When he answered, his breath caught. "What does the church have going on this week?" It wasn't Eddie's voice. This time it was a woman. "Who is this?" Robert demanded, gripping the receiver. The line crackled, then went dead. Robert's mind raced. A new voice meant a new layer to the mystery. Was it someone else from the congregation? Or was this something deeper, more personal? The following morning, Robert called Daniel to share the development. "A woman this time?" Daniel asked, scribbling notes. "Yes, the question was the same, though," Robert said. "Do you think it could be connected to Eddie?" Daniel frowned. "It's possible, but this complicates things. We need to look at the broader picture. Who might have shared Eddie's concerns or been close to him before his death?" Margaret joined them later, her face pale. "You need to know something," she said, her voice trembling. She recounted a strange dream she'd had the night before, where Eddie stood at the church door, holding a calendar and pointing to a blank Wednesday. "It felt real," she said, her hands shaking, "like he was trying to tell me something." Convinced that answers lay in Eddie's past, Robert and Daniel began interviewing members of the congregation who had been closest to him. One by one, they pieced together a picture of a man deeply devoted to his faith but quietly troubled. Eddie had confided in a few that he felt the church was losing its way, becoming more focused on appearances than substance. "Wednesday nights were his way of bringing people back to the heart of faith," said Clara, an elderly church member who had known Eddie for decades. "He wanted those nights to be about real connection." Robert's chest tightened. Was Eddie's voice reaching out to remind them of that mission? Or was there something darker at play? The calls began to divide the congregation. Some saw them as a sign of Eddie's lingering presence, while others whispered about darker forces at work. During a Sunday service, Robert addressed the tension directly. "We may not understand what's happening," he said, his voice steady, "but we must face it with faith and unity. Whatever these calls mean, they're tied to Eddie's love for this church." His words brought a measure of calm, but the unease lingered. One afternoon, James approached Robert with a strange discovery. "I was cleaning out the old storage room," he said, "and I found this." He handed Robert a dusty tape recorder. "It belonged to Eddie. There's a tape inside." Robert hesitated, then pressed play. The recording crackled to life. Eddie's voice filled the room, speaking in a calm, deliberate tone. "I feel like I'm running out of time," Eddie said. "There's so much I haven't said, so much I wanted to do. If anyone finds this, please, don't let Wednesdays be forgotten." The tape ended abruptly, leaving Robert and James in stunned silence. Daniel listened to the tape later that evening. "It's clear Eddie felt strongly about this, but it doesn't explain the calls," he said. "What if the calls aren't about the prayer group at all?" Robert asked. "What if we're missing something?" They decided to revisit the phone company, hoping to find a lead they'd overlooked. This time, they spoke to an older technician who had been with the company for decades. "Blank caller IDs are rare these days," she said, frowning at the logs. "But back in the day, we'd get them from old switchboards or systems with outdated wiring." She paused. "Your church lines haven't been updated in years, have they?" Robert's stomach sank. "No, they haven't." The technician nodded. "It's possible the calls are coming from within your own system, maybe an old connection or recording that's looping somehow." Robert and Daniel decided to inspect the church's phone system. With James's help, They traced the lines through the building, eventually finding an old junction box in the basement. Inside, they discovered a tangle of wires and a small, outdated switchboard. One of the lines was marked E. Sanders. "This must have been Eddie's office line," James said. Robert's hands trembled as he touched the label. "But it hasn't been used in years." That Wednesday, Robert stayed late again, determined to confront the next call. When the phone rang, he answered immediately. "What does the church have going on this week?" This time, Robert didn't hesitate. "Eddie, if this is you, tell me what you want." The line crackled, and for the first time, there was a pause before the voice replied. "Don't forget." The call ended, leaving Robert in the silence of the empty church.